Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to today's SBDX webinar. We are very pleased to have you with us today to talk about CEO and board dynamics. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. And if you are new to us, I encourage you to go to our website and check out some of our past programs as well as our calendar of events coming up. This is one of many webinars that we hold around topics very relevant to board directors. Today's session will be 60 minutes in length. We will be recording today's session for viewing at a later date. And if you have any questions, we encourage you to submit them throughout today's webinar. Please don't wait until the last 15 minutes. Just go ahead and type it into the chat feature on the Q&A, and we will try to fold them in as appropriate throughout today's discussion. It's really my pleasure to introduce very briefly our three fantastic panelists and moderator. So delighted to have them with us. I think this will be a really invigorating and enlightening conversation. Stephen Miles is the founder and CEO of the Miles Group and brings over 26 years of experience partnering with CEOs, emerging C-suite talent, and boards of directors to drive impact for organizations. Stephen is one of the world's top business coaches and has developed an extensive library of leadership content that he uses to support a model of high-performing coaching with CEOs and COOs across the globe. He was profiled in Bloomberg Businessweek as the CEO Whisperer and is host of C-Suite Intelligence, a business podcast helping leaders everywhere reach their maximum potential. Amy Guggenheim Shanken is an experienced public company and private equity-backed corporate director, public company officer, president, and former McKinsey & Company digital transformation leader. Amy's operating experience spans 35 years and includes leadership positions in industry powerhouses such as McKinsey & Company, GE, Wells Fargo, Travelocity, and Common Sense Media. Shanken has served on both public and PE-owned corporate boards for over 14 years. She currently sits on the boards of EverCommerce, Ring Central, Report Local, Pickles Auctions, Hybrid Apparel, and here at SVDX, we're very fortunate that she is also a member of our board. Our moderator for today, David Larker, is the James Irvin Miller Professor of Accounting Emeritus at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's also the director of the Corporate Governance Research Initiative at Stanford Graduate School of Business and is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. His most recent book, written with Brian Tyan, is The Art and Practice of Corporate Governance. Once again, thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to Dave, Amy, and Stephen. Dave, I'll pass the microphone off to you.
All right, thanks. It's great to be here. This promises to be a really fun setting. Just introduce it here a little bit. I think we all would agree that strong CEO board relationship is generally considered to be essential for organizational success. But the relationship is hard to manage. It's care, clarity, and trust involved. And today we'll discuss some of this about how to develop it, what it is, how it creates value, and things like that. And so we'll also, toward the end, we'll also take a look at how formal coaching and the so-called kitchen cabinet the CEO might have, help develop these relationships and can strengthen board effectiveness. And we'll take a little bit of look of some recent stuff that Stephen and I have done with regard to coaching and kitchen cabinets. So let me open up, but maybe kind of the obvious question is what does a good CEO board relationship actually look like? And again, we're looking at it from a behind the closed doors. What might we see? What does it look like to experts and things like this? So let me kick it off with Amy. What do you think what a good one looks like, Amy?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here and great to be having this conversation with you guys. So to me, in a sentence, it's a good one looks like a high trust partnership that is anchored in value creation, meaning value creation for shareholders as the North Star. And everybody, the CEO and the board, are super focused on that. And so the CEO, and we'll get into more of the details of this, but the CEO is committed to a no surprises, full transparency, engaging the board for in a strategic partnership, and the board is committed to fulfilling their role, which is not, as we know, operators, but rather a sounding board for the CEO, along with the fiduciary responsibilities. And everybody has a clear understanding of their roles. But to me, again, the best relationships are grounded in trust, which takes time and careful thought and consideration to develop.
Yeah, thanks. Stephen, what do you think?
I just build on what Amy said because she captured it extremely well. I think it's bi-directional. When they get lopsided in some way, the board wants to provide too much value and the CEO doesn't want to engage with their board. I think you need evenness related to the commitment and evenness related to the trust. And every CEO I've ever coached, I always say you get the board you deserve. And it's absolutely true. And so the CEO and his or her leadership team need to invest in the board and they need to grow together. It's not sort of a static relationship. You have to grow together or you grow apart generally. And it's growing together in both dimensions. The board's growing and the CEO and his or her leadership team are growing with the board.
Yeah. So what are some of the things you think really help build that relationship and things that, really maybe stop it or even go backward? What would be you know, some of the good flags and the red flags on these kind of things? Steve, what do you think?
I mean, the good flags, I think, are obvious, right? Trust and transparency. Like trust is built over time, it accrues. And, one aw shucks, and generally you go back to zero. So it truly is something that you're committed to. And the transparency part of it is an open relationship. On the board side, you need to be able to handle the transparency, right? If you're have good intent as a CEO, you have tons of transparency, and then the board's jumping all over you relative to that transparency, right? You typically recoil. And so that's why the relationship is bi-directional and growing together. And I think a few hygiene things that are really important, like, some CEOs want to have their leadership team involved in everything all of the time. Other CEOs want to have no leadership team unless they are coming in presenting. And I think a balance of CEO and his or her leadership time with the board and also a balance of solo time so the CEO can have a board dinner solo on some occasions and just talk about sort of where they're at, where the business is at, and engage with the board sort of outside of the specifics of the boardroom environment to build a deeper relationship and to open up more to things that are on their mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just following up a little bit, what is kind of like, the disaster scenario where the CEO just doesn't want the board, views it as something to get through the quarterly meetings so they get the real work, or it's somebody that's really doesn't trust the board or doesn't want the feedback, things like that.
I mean, for me, coaching CEOs, the challenge that happens is you have to wear two hats. You have to be the CEO of the company and you have to be a peer director.
Hmm.
And when you get that imbalanced, oftentimes, if you have the CEO as the shop steward for management on every issue, right, you create this imbalance because they can't put their director hat on and have the director
Hmm.
conversations. And I think that balance is really, really important. What we're really talking about here is a shared context, right? You want to have a shared context between management and the board, understanding that the board is there, periodically, episodically. They often forget, right? There's board amnesia. You got other things going on in your life. And so creating context and sharing context in a non-condescending way where you can invite board members into the conversation. Like the CEO's job is to create relevance for directors, right? And if you don't create relevance for directors, they choose their own relevance. And
Yeah.
generally that's unhelpful if you're the CEO.
No, that's a
You
good
want to
point.
create shared context, which creates shared relevance, and then invite the board to participate with you and the management team relative to, as Amy said, create value.
Yeah. As you're
I,
talk, as you go ahead, Amy, I'm sorry.
yeah, I
Go ahead.
was just going to say, just to double click a bit on what Stephen is saying. I think there's specific actions that a CEO can take to foster the underlying trust, and specific actions that the board can take as well that that help the dynamic, especially help the dynamic period, but help the dynamic, especially if there's a CEO that doesn't necessarily see the value in a board. But in terms of things a CEO can do to build trust with the board is, adopt a no surprise
Hmm.
sort of norm and posture. You have to share bad news early, own the outcomes. So, I've seen CEOs that either do or do not sort of say the buck stops with them in terms of um, accountability. Don't spin, just be super honest. Don't curate information to the board. CEO should show vulnerability and he or she doesn't have to do it alone. He shouldn't or she shouldn't um, not share sort of even half-baked sort of strategic thinking because they're concerned about not appearing fully buttoned up, adopting an attitude of like, hey, the board can help me and push me and pressure test my
Hmm.
assumptions. And I'd also say, and I think Stephen mentioned this before, again, on the side of the ledger where the CEO can do things that will help him or her, which is build individual relationships with board members.
Yeah.
Way easier. I'm a big proponent of in-person board meetings, way easier to
Right.
build trust and build deeper relationships. Because ultimately, if the CEO feels like the board has his or her back, it creates a much, much better dynamic.
Yeah.
And I do think there's things that the board can do as well, um, to help foster that kind of trust in a environment that is much more beneficial to a strategic partnership.
Yeah. I kind of reflected on something Steven said in passing, where he said, the CEO wears kind of two hats, right? There's the CEO hat, the operating person, but there's also a board member, right? I wonder if it's easier to build that trust if that CEO is also on at least one external board, where that person is sitting on not at the head of the table, but on the side where you're actually a real board member. You think that's helpful to build the kind of trust in your own organization?
I I
Go
would,
ahead, Amy.
yeah, I would say it's certainly helpful. When you're a CEO and you have a board, and then you are also simultaneously experiencing being on a different board and
Yeah.
seeing that CEO, it helps you understand the board CEO dynamic in a way that's different.
Mm,
And I think gives the person a lot more empathy and understanding for, the role of the CEO, the role of the board in making an excellent partnership. So I definitely advise CEOs and also members of the executive team to get on a board or to just to see it from the other angle.
yeah. Steve,
I concur 100%. I
yeah.
mean, a lot of the people that I coach who aspire to be the CEO someday, I work hard on their current CEO to give them permission and their board to give them permission to be on one external board. It's an incredible experience. It's expansive. You get empathy. You get to sit on the other side of the table. You get to build relationships with other directors. It's just an incredible growth opportunity for every executive. And generally, this is about sort of expansion. It really expands them. So if they are chosen to be the CEO, they are in a much different place when they start.
Yeah. Yeah, they
Or
got a
even
better
if it is
background. Yeah.
one, great for development, but two, even if it is a sitting CEO, same things apply where they just it you use the word Stephen empathy, which I really like because it
Mm,
gives them empathy on both sides of the equation and how it takes a functioning board and a well-functioning CEO to make that magic work.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to press down his path just a little bit. I mean, that's the thing about, well, there's this big push in the States, at least, to separate CEO and chair role. And, how does this kind of relationship between the CEO and the board, change if the CEO is not the chairman of the board? I mean, does it make it easier, more difficult? I mean, obviously the chair sets the agenda and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, does that have any bearing on these things or not?
I'll just take a different perspective. I mean, I've
Yeah,
spent 25 years working with Australian companies, which I
yeah,
deeply value. They have a different model, more the UK model, where every chair is
right,
separated. There's good and bad associated with this. Like you can have a strong lead director here and have a chair and CEO and have a great relationship and create tons of value together. If you have a bad if you have a less effective person in the role, whether it's lead director or separated chair, it generally doesn't go as well as it could. And I think that whether it's chair or separated chair and or lead director, I think the selection of that person is very, very important. I'm less in the camp of you just rotate people through the lead director role. I
right.
really believe it needs to be somebody with the right constitution to lead their peers, to engage with management, to build a special relationship with the CEO and the management team relative to value creation and support, as Amy said. And that can go badly no matter what your model, or
Hmm.
it can go incredibly well no matter what your model. But I think you need to, the only business we're in is the people business. You need to get this aspect of the people business, thoughtfully done.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it gets even more complicated. Say that the sitting chair was the ex-CEO and they brought in a new CEO underneath of that. And I think, I have a lot of qualms about that sort of setting, but I can imagine the inconsistency of, who's the CEO and who's the board bonding with and that type of thing is pretty complicated in that setting. It'd be a good reason maybe not to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you want
Yeah.
independence, right? And you also want the incumbent CEO to be able to go after their agenda, obviously aligned with the board. And sometimes
Hmm.
if you have somebody who, and not, this doesn't always happen, but if you have somebody who's steering their own agenda and has the power to do that, it can really create some weird dynamics.
Yeah.
I would just add to that actually, because I think typically when you think about CEO succession, oftentimes it could be because a CEO isn't performing, but it's often that there is some new reality that the business is operating in, that it's time to pass the baton to enable somebody else who has a different set of skills that can take you to a different outcome. And if you have the former CEO sitting there, I think that's difficult. I mean,
Yeah.
it just creates tension and
Yeah.
feels
So,
unproductive.
since Amy brought that up, let's maybe talk a little bit about succession planning in this setting. I mean, we've at Stanford, we've written a series of articles about Disney, one of the great U.S. companies, and let's just say has had a bunch of ups and downs involving some Stanford MBA alums, but I mean, in terms of succession planning, and again, not to pick on Disney or whatever, but that kind of trust seems like it'd be pretty important to build where you have that board CEO dynamic where, we're going to have to think about new people or either internal or externally. How does how might that play out here in this thing? I know both of you have been involved in lots of these sort of settings.
Um, my experience with succession planning relative to my understanding of sort of like at least academically what it should look like in terms of the day you start succession planning is the day the new
Yeah,
CEO starts. And I think there's lots of goodness to that in terms of it makes it such that the conversation isn't awkward at the time that you have to have the conversation. It enables you to find a deeper bench of people, and it enables you to start thinking about, like, again, I just think about, a company is a going concern, and there's different stages of the relay race, and a thoughtful succession plan is about, as I was sort of saying before, it's about thinking about, we were talking about hockey before, like where the puck is going, and finding a CEO and frankly a board who has the ability to take you there. And I do think again that having the former CEO be outside of the picture in any formal way is a helpful thing to do.
I would just add, like, I think most boards um, really pride themselves on doing a fair amount of work on succession planning. It used to not happen as much, but today you go into any boardroom and succession is clearly a prime topic. I think
Hmm.
that the challenge that we have now is succession activities versus an operational succession plan. So activities, we have the binder, we have the org chart, everybody's pictures on the org chart. The person who joined the leadership team last fills most recently fills most of the CEO succession buckets, and then their star fades, and the next person who joins the team is populated across. And if you take a board privately and say, okay, let's pull your binder out and talk about succession planning in a real place, like somebody wins the lottery tomorrow and you have to pick, they like throw their arms up in the air. So it's truly activity based, and I think the
Hmm.
activity based version of CEO succession planning satiates a lot of people because we're doing things. But when you actually have to do the thing, it's less satiating. And McDonald's has the world record in here because I used to think this isn't possible. But in an 18-month period of time, many years ago, they replaced three CEOs. Two died, and then they put Jim Skinner in 18 months, and they didn't go to the outside. They promoted from within. And if you were a shareholder of McDonald's during the Skinner era, you did extremely well in your portfolio. So they were that deep in their bench and they were willing to make the selection decision in an 18-month period where that person was not selected the first time or the second time. And it's incredible. Like I think the bar needs to be higher relative. Can we pick somebody as opposed to talk about people? And obviously, you have to start to use different language on the board, right? I never use ready now because by definition, anybody inside the company has not done the job before, so they're not ready now ever. So, do we have viable candidates? That viability is determined against the future needs of the company, and it's a multi-person event. The surrounding leadership team, including the board, in terms of anchoring that person and their success if you chose them. And the other part that's really, really important is because many board members, if you have a successful incumbent CEO, will always compare somebody to the incumbent and they always fall short. And so the language here around, I always say to people, we need a new original, not a bad copy of your CEO. And that's true. And when you unlock them on new original and you anchor that in the needs of the company, the future needs of the company, and different eras require different kinds of CEOs. So new original really, really works here. You can start to unlock people as it relates to a viable candidate and their candidacy in maybe a window. It's always 1 to 3 years, and 1 to 3 years goes by, and we can never pick a person, right? So in that window, we can actually go from activity based to operational, and we're willing to pick somebody.
Yeah. I guess one maybe twist and maybe more Silicon Valley specific is, you know, building this trust between the board and the CEO in a company that's still run by the founder, that's had grand success, made a lot of money for investors and things like that. And I guess that person probably is not exactly, but sort of handpicked their board a bit. Is that easier or harder, or if it going over time, is it harder to maintain this kind of trusting relationship? What's kind of your experience there?
Well, founders are a special case of this, at least my own experience, because some founders choose to institutionalize power using B shares or having
Hmm.
super majority voting rights. But I've worked with a number of founders that have that. They've institutionalized that, and I think they started out kind of rough with their board, basically thinking that their board isn't adding enough value to them and helping them create value from a company perspective. And look, if you're a public company, you've chosen to go public, and there's a lot of, water you got to carry on the board in order to sustain and maintain and thrive in a public company environment. And there are many directors who, do that work extremely well. And founders often look at these point-to-point interactions and say, okay, is this interaction creating value for me or not? And generally it's, unsatiating for them because they can go talk to somebody, one of their peers who's, in the same stratosphere as they are, doing similar things in 2033, even though we're in 2026, and they can have those conversations. But if you change the trajectory and your mindset and the prism to say, okay, like, what do I actually need around the table? And, in terms of us maintaining and thriving as a public company, what are the kinds of people we need around the table to do that work? And valuing that work most importantly, as
Yeah.
opposed to thinking that it's, other people's jobs to do that, and you value that work. It's incredibly unlocking from my perspective. And the other thing that's really important is, many founders want to get like world's experts on their board in specific domain areas. And I'm like, you can go find that, buy it, just send them a text and get the most prescient version of that any day of the week. And as soon as you put like deep, deep expertise on your board, you create board experts. And then they
Hmm.
believe that they are first among equals on the board on whatever that topic is. And they dislocate the total relevance of the board and the participation of the board. So I always say to every CEO, we want board expertise as opposed to board experts. And we need people on the board, even if they have deep mastery and domain knowledge, to provide that mastery and domain knowledge in an expertise format as opposed to expert format so the rest of the board can participate with them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It's
that
it,
mindset tends to unlock a lot of this.
yeah.
David, I was thinking as you were asking the question that when I started serving on boards, I heard a term that you guys have probably heard, which is if you've seen one board, you've seen one board. And it took me quite a number of years to actually internalize that. And my experience is yes, you can have a founder CEO who institutionalizes sort of an autocratic CEO kind of environment, but I'm currently on the board of two companies with CEO founders, and we just took another one private. And I would say these CEOs are very interested in gaining expertise from their board and leveraging their board. And it's very so I would say it's very CEO and situation
Yeah.
dependent.
Yeah. I love that. I think that'll be the next paper that we write. If you've seen one board, you've seen one board. And I do completely appreciate that. Maybe let's switch gears just a little bit, get a little more specific. Let's say you have a board that's there's a lot of trust and there's the information that's provided to the board isn't highly manipulated and by the management, and it's sort of like all the things you read about, like here's the good relationships between the board and the CEO. And where the board is not trying to run the company, right? I mean, they're trying to provide real insight and guidance, but they're not trying to do the CEO's role. I mean, what kind of things have you seen that's really created a lot of value inside the organization, where you have this, like we're behind the door here, we're seeing this a constructive relationship. What kind of things have you seen where it's really worked out, where it's stopped the company from going down a bad path, or it's sort of highlighted certain things strategically or compliance wise or whatever, where it's really been helpful. I guess I'm looking for, how's the value created,
Yeah. I think it's, my experience, it can be created lots of ways and it depends on the specific situation of the company. But, one example is if you have high trust between the board and the CEO, it gives you the ability to have, what I'd call courageous conversations, bold conversations where you're really debating, you're pressure testing assumptions, you're really challenging the CEO and the management team. And, I have had an experience on the board where the board was, I mean, the team was slow to basically get on board with the fact that they were in a situation where it was either let technology, in this case AI, disrupt you, or
Hmm.
actually leverage it to your strategic advantage. And I think the board was able to provide a level of urgency to that conversation that the CEO, who respected the board, internalized, and the team internalized it and made pretty significant shifts within a pretty short amount of time. If you did not have that kind of trust, it could have easily deteriorated into something quite different.
I would I build on that. Like in my coaching of people, I always say for leadership teams, you need content friction without behavioral friction, right?
Hmm.
Easy to say, really hard to
Yeah.
institutionalize. In order to get to a place where you have content friction, it's really hard, right? Because what happens, generally board members don't enter the conversation perfectly. They just kind of want to participate. And it's rough entry, let's just say it. And then you get defensive and you either put the gloves up or you're shut down, right? So now we don't have content friction. We have a behavioral interaction that needs to be corrected or fixed at some period of time. And we shelve whatever we were talking about. So to get to a place where you actually have content friction, for me, you have to work on this together. And the way, I was on a board for 10 years, and the way that the management team got there, because I always used to feel like I had to fight to enter, right?
Hmm.
Because somebody being stream of consciousness, that everything had a bow on it, and you're trying to enter, and as soon as you enter, of course, roughly, somebody gets grumpy, and then you have to have that interaction. And what I found was if you invite people to participate with you in the conversation, you put some framing questions on the 1,000 pages that you have to consume, and those framing questions allow you to consume the information differently and formulate your thoughts. And you have landing spots in your presentation where we're going to talk about. Then I'm not hijacking your conversation. I let your stream of consciousness go. I let you to present because I know we have a landing spot. I know you've given me some questions to think about, and now we can participate. And I find that level of content friction goes way up. It's good friction. And the behavioral friction goes way down because we've created these opportunities for the board to engage as opposed to you have to break in.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, obviously the social dynamics, who gets to ask the question? Should this question be asked now? Am I the right person to ask it? All that kind of stuff. I guess, um, yeah, but ultimately, I mean, if the trust is built up, even if you enter the conversation roughly, it's going to be acknowledged and you could have a conversation. I mean, I guess early on in my board work, I learned pretty quickly that you don't want to enter a conversation where the first word in your sentence is look, like, look, hey, this is
Hmm.
all screwed up or something. And let's just say I had some, you know, outside the boardroom suggestion that maybe that's not the way to enter, in a constructive way. But ultimately, if I was on that board for a long time, you could sort of have something that's a little rough, but then, it's like, okay, um, it's they know you're bringing it up for kind of the right reasons,
Right.
and you have that trust, and then it goes from there. But it is sort of fascinating, when you have these conversations. Stephen, what's some examples where you sort of, you got this trust was built up and you've seen it, and then it's been really positive for the company, and really helped both the board and the CEO create a lot of value. Can you come up with, not naming names, but here's some examples of that?
Well, I think just broadly, if you look at sort of the sort of credit card environment, there, one of the credit card companies, had an iconic CEO. He retired after an incredible career, and new CEO came in, new original, not a bad copy, and has created $170 billion of value in his 6 years, right? And you think these, when you're transitioning, it's not a baton handoff many people talk about it that way, but I'm like, no, we're not in stride here. Board's resetting at zero, CEO's resetting at zero as a new CEO, and then we're going to align on the, value creation opportunity for the company, and we're going to grow together. And it's a great example of that. Publicly, we just saw the Walmart handoff, if you will. I think Doug surprised a lot of people in terms of, where he decided to get onto the off ramp. He's putting Walmart first in all of his public statements, and you follow him on LinkedIn. He basically said, in my language, he couldn't run a fast enough 800 anymore, and he needed John to come in who could run a faster 800, which is like amazing, like truly, truly amazing for somebody to put the company first
Yeah.
after his success in the role, working with the board and the family in order to, position the right and develop the right next successor, and putting it all in as it relates to him running a faster 800 next
Yeah.
year. I think that kind of mindset is true value creation. And look, they're the only non-tech company to break $1 trillion. It's true value creation that we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd say another outside in positive example is just from my reading around the transition from Steve Ballmer to Satya Nadella, where
Hmm.
Nadella came in and executed a massive strategic pivot for an incredibly large organization. And my understanding is that he was super clear about really early in his tenure articulating a thesis around cloud first
Right.
and mobile first and putting the capital behind it. I presume not obviously wasn't there, but that the conversations with the board were open and clear, and the basis of his thesis was clear. And he also spoke publicly, and I'm sure privately with the board, about the cultural transformation
Hmm.
that had to go along
Hmm.
with it. And to me, that's just a fabulous example of, it seems, because this is a not behind closed doors example because
Right.
it's outside in, but
Right.
of a CEO managing that transition really adeptly.
Yeah, we got a question here. I think maybe we could talk a little bit. I'm sure you've seen this, and I've seen this as well, where CEO or chair really doesn't want the board members to speak with other members of management, and so it's kind of, you're holding the information. Yeah, it's always a very odd thing. Are you overstepping your bounds as a board member? I mean, obviously, I think we would all agree that, if a board member wanted to talk to, say, the head of marketing or something, you'd want to inform the CEO that you'd like to do that, and then so it's not a surprise. But of course, it puts the vice president of marketing in an incredibly peculiar position, right? Because the board member is asking for things that, you know that maybe CEO is not committed. I mean, do you think, like, if you had a situation like that, do you think that this completely destroys the trust between the CEO and board members, or is just the natural, professionalism that would occur?
I'd flip it to say that, like, again, this is the kind of environment that's so important to create, where the CEO, I do, for example, if I am communicating with a member of the management team, I copy the CEO, especially at the beginning. But at some point, um, if you know the team well enough and you have the trust of the CEO, and the
Hmm.
CEO knows that you're not asking for things, but you're providing advice to the team, then it shouldn't be you know, as much as you can, as much as there you can decrease the level of information asymmetry between the board and the company, the more value added the board can be. And I think board members also have to be careful when they're talking to the CEO, and in particular when they're talking to the team, about not asking for them to do anything, but rather just being there as a sounding board and providing
Yeah.
advice. Because otherwise, you start to quickly slip into operations that are not your role, which then
Right.
further erodes trust.
Right.
I mean, I would just say like this is tricky. It's can you handle the truth kind of a conversation because some board members can't handle the truth, and some board members can't actually help themselves, and you actually inadvertently create asymmetries of information. And there's board members who want to sort of satiate their intellectual curiosity inside the company, and they create all of these cottage industries for
Yeah,
management to go satiate their curiosity, which is extremely unhelpful. I
right.
do think the chain of command here is important. I do, if I was a CEO and there's a bunch of tentacles below me, like I would find that extremely unhelpful. I don't mind people talking to board, but I definitely would like to, have a schedule related to that. I'd like to understand sort of what's the pretense behind it, and I would like some debrief as it relates to their
Hmm.
conversation. So
Hmm.
my trusting relationship with the board is not being asymmetrically skewered by somebody else, who actually doesn't understand how to handle the truth, who doesn't understand governance, and, is saying things often contextually not relevant and then activating in either direction, board to the board or back into management that is really, really unhelpful. And then basically you have to go fix that. And
Yeah,
fixing these things takes lots of time and effort, right? You get an aw shucks and you go back to zero.
right.
So I'm a big fan of the board interacting with management. I just think it needs to be handled in a good process delivers good outcomes kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of you can't handle the truth, of course, one of my favorite movies, but let's sort of switch gears a little bit. And Steve and I have done recent pretty big survey on the use of coaches, professional coaches, paid coaches by CEOs, but also looking at the use of the so-called kitchen cabinet. And I guess that goes back to, I don't know, Churchill days or whatever, but kind of informal people that you trust and you want some opinions about. Um, Nancy, I'm sure, has sent links to all this stuff. It's all free. Please read it. We probably won't talk too much about it today, but we also did an assessment of the similar coaching and kitchen cabinets of board members. And maybe not surprisingly, board members tend not to use professional coaches, but they have a very deep, detailed kitchen cabinet that helps them, you know, understand, or you can bounce ideas off of other people that you trust. So let me kind of switch gears into this. So with coaching or kitchen cabinets, or other helpers, how does that help you kind of build the trust between the CEO and the board, or help you do the CEO's job better, those kind of things. What kind of insights can you offer the group on those types of things? Maybe,
Well,
yeah, Steve, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I just think we've like entered a new era. Not everybody's head is where I'm about to say, but I would say directionally we're entering a new era where coaching was remedial in the 20th century. For most people, it's not considered remedial anymore. It's considered something you do in order to continue to expand and grow and increase your performance in many dimensions. A lot of coaching, at least I spend my life coaching CEOs. A lot of coaching is just having a trusted relationship where you have broad triangulation and you're supporting somebody in their own triangulation on a topic where they want to talk to you about a specific topic. It could be a board relationship, it could be a board dynamic, it could be something related to people in the organization, it could be something personal related to them. And you're triangulating information. I try to do it with content. I've written 400 coaching notes to support the people that I coach. So it's not read a book or an HBR article, although you should do that as well. But it's really targeted to help them continue to expand and grow. And I think the challenge that every CEO has and every leader has, doesn't matter if you're the CEO, is you get into your job and you need to outgrow your job every year. And if you're the CEO, you need to outgrow the company every year and the aspiration that you have for the company. And that just doesn't happen by accident. You have to be focused on it. You have to have tools related to it. And generally, if you have a small supporting group of people that you deeply trust, that only care about you growing and being more successful and thriving and have some body of mastery that each one of them has that can help you triangulate information as you work through wicked hard problems. That to me is expansion and growth, not remediation. And most of the people that I coach, they would call me their coach in their first year. I think anything past that, they would say that you're an advisor to them as opposed to a coach. Some like coach all the way through, but a lot of them flip you to advisor.
Yeah. Amy, what do you think?
I love the fact that it feels like we've moved from what Steven said, this sort of remedial, you get a coach if there's a problem, to you
Hmm.
have a coach to help you with your leadership development. I always think about the fact that like Carlos Alcaraz has a coach, Steph Curry has a coach. It's a, enormously positive thing. Um, and I also feel like that, you know, it's not a coach per se, but I think a super high quality board where board members have trusted relationships with the CEO, that boards can be a strategic advisor, a strategic coach. I think they're different conversations typically. Um, but to me, like that, that is the essence of how you actually take a
Yeah.
board from just a sort of fiduciary oversight to a real strategic asset, is that you are that sounding board for the CEO and the team. And it's all about, how do you drive profitable growth for the business, and how do you help the CEO realize their potential?
Yeah. It's tricky when that relationship goes from, because you're a fiduciary, into where you're very personal, but that's another area we can explore. But our survey was kind of interesting. We did kind of the same survey 10 years ago and today. 10 years ago, I think it was viewed as remedial, and only about a third of the CEOs had a coach. Now it's up to around 60%. And I think, and not surprisingly, a lot of the CEOs, have kind of a kitchen cabinet of, people they went to school with, or boards they've been on, or whatever. It could be childhood friends, whatever, that they rely on. So I mean, the CEO, almost 100% either use a coach and or a kitchen cabinet to inform them. And I think it's pretty smart because the world, not surprisingly, has gotten a hell of a lot more complicated, and and it's bigger. I mean, how do you protect yourself from the blind spots and other things, like that? And so I think it's really, really smart. No doubt there are some CEOs that are uncoachable, just like some athletes are uncoachable. But I think that's the rare setting, and probably a setting where it's either going to be really fantastic or a disaster for performance. I don't think there's much middle ground there. So so yeah, go ahead, Amy,
Yeah, I
please.
was going to
Yeah.
say, David, maybe this is where you were going, and I'd say conversely, I view board work as a lifelong learning journey, and
Yes.
the environment is much more complicated, and being a director demands a lot more time and energy and knowledge than it did a decade ago. And maybe you don't have a coach, but like I think most of us have a sort of our own personal board of
Yes.
advisor peers that we talk to, and just to put in a plug, we're all on this SBDX forum, like SBDX or NACD, or the board forums that investment banks do, or the accounting firms. I mean, I know that I do, and most of my board colleagues spend a lot of time doing things like this, because otherwise we're just sitting in a boardroom recreating a wheel that's
Right.
happening
Right.
again and
Right.
again across the country.
No, I think it's exactly right. I mean, let's talk about the kind of things you would talk about with a formal coach versus things you would talk about, with your personal board of directors, or what I'm calling the kitchen cabinet. What kind of difference things are there? Steve, maybe
I mean,
pick it
I
up?
mean, I mean, I coach a lot with content. I care a lot about that as opposed to, just having a nice conversation with somebody relative to a topic. So I try to drive specific business outcomes. It's not that I don't have an advisory relationship in many of these instances, but oftentimes, like the problem statement or the opportunity statement is relative to like organizational design. I've done a lot of work at Stanford. I have a new book coming out on the riding shotgun, the third edition with Stanford in July. Done a lot of work on the COO role. So many
Mm,
CEOs are thinking about, should I have a COO? How would I define it? There isn't really a sort of a modern sort of classic version of that. You kind of create it around the needs of the CEO and the needs of the company. So there's lots of work you can think through, and sometimes that's positive, sometimes that's not good for the company or the organization. A lot of topics are around what I would call hyperalignment. Like, how do you translate the message of the organization and the strategy down into the organization? So, from my coaching perspective, just to give an illustrative example, I think the greatest leverage every CEO has is their second circle, which I would define as depends on the size of the company, from 25 to 150 people. They would love to be enrolled, they'd love to be engaged, and they're often not. It's like we have town halls once in a while, we get together once in a while, but it's not programmatic. And so, part of this hyper alignment methodology is to say, okay, every 2 weeks or once a month, can we create a form with our second circle and enroll and engage them? And enroll engagement for me is context, right? Context is the knowing doing equation. If you know stuff, you can do stuff. And most people don't know stuff, so they have less agency in doing stuff. So part of this is dynamic context setting through the second circle, driving sort of value creation back to Amy's original point. What are the needle movers for the organization for 2026? How do we connect people to those needle movers? And then how do we connect them to the context that provides them with more agency to do more often? And so a lot of the topics are related to that. Lots of board topics related to I have a problematic director, and that's not uncommon. And then, as the CEO, how do I navigate that? Because it's a delicate situation. Or I'm recruiting a director. Help me think through like what would be the best configuration and
mm,
sets of capabilities and experiences to support both me and the board looking forward. Obviously, the board chooses, but the CEO often comes and says, well, they're giving me an interview slot, which is wonderful. How would you think about this interview? So a lot of it sort of dynamically forms around specific topics, and then I try to drive specific coaching topics that I think can help amplify their leadership
mhm.
or add range to them from a CEO perspective.
Yeah. Amy, you want to add to that or
Um, I feel like Stephen
we
laid
nailed
it
it?
out.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm.
I guess the one thing we sort of find, what kind of topics do you have in the coaching versus kitchen cabinet? And yeah, I guess this is obvious, but I mean, in the kind of kitchen cabinet, there seem to be a lot more topics related to life work balance and in some cases mental health issues that you would do with let me call it personal friends or people you really intimately trust versus things that would happen in with a formal coach, which would be more. I think Steve did a nice job. It's more specific, strategic, things like that, or something that, you have some sort of, maybe unfortunate event that occurs, or you have a problematic director. I mean, I think we all know it's pretty painful to ask somebody to leave the board, or can you maybe try to get them some coaching so they can, become more useful on the board. But
Yeah. And
um,
I'd contrast, David, those
yeah.
those kinds of conversations with the kind of conversations that I would tend to have with CEOs, which are
Mhm.
like, hey, let's talk about go to market and what we're
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
now and what the from to might look like, or
yeah,
let's talk about, capital allocation. Are we, what's our risk posture, and are we driving too much money to pay down our debt or buy back shares, and should we be using it for M&A? So much more of the more business oriented
yes,
kinds of
yes,
things, as if you were to draw a clear
right.
separation. That is sort of how I would think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, Steve.
I would just say, look, I know it's cliche, but it truly is lonely and often not the most pleasant experience being a CEO, even though there's lots of pleasant things that you do. I always think about it as, when you reside in the last office, which the CEO does, everybody else has a last office to go into, and there's support oftentimes, and you get good at winning in the context of going into whatever last office. When you sit in the last office, the biggest thing for most CEOs is the weight of the world that now resides within that last office. And supporting them and triangulating them and really helping them develop a process for sort of the wicked hard decision making, I think is really, really important. And you mentioned it, like, a lot of personal things. Like, it's not that I don't talk about personal things with the CEOs I coach. Often there are lots of personal things that come up, but most of it is around supporting them and
Hmm.
providing them with the right triangulation and advice relative to the weight and the loneliness of making big decisions that have huge implications for their employees and their shareholders, and owning a process to do that. And I think having some form of a kitchen cabinet where you can triangulate with people who have various forms of mastery to help you solidify in your head what the right direction is ultimately to make that last office decision is incredibly helpful for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we've got about, I guess, 4 minutes in this. Maybe just kind of last words from our panelists, things that the participants here can kind of take to heart. Here's a high level whatever with regard to what's behind the door and things like that. Amy, you want to kick us
Yeah,
off with a couple points?
sure. I mean, I go back to this high trust partnership that is an incredibly useful, value added way to have a relationship between a board and a CEO. And I think that the key things to understand are it doesn't happen by happenstance, it happens by intention. And there are sets of things that the CEO has to do, and there are sets of things that the board has to do. One thing that we have not talked a lot about that I would just add is, in my experience, having an exceptional chair, whether it's the chair of the board or the lead independent, can make a really massive difference on the quality of the board and the conversations and the relationship. So that's one other thing that I would highlight.
Thank you, Steve.
I would just say, look, let's try to work our succession plans from being activity based to more operational. And obviously, it's a lifelong journey, but more operational is better. I think figure out a way, if you're on the management side of the equation, to create content friction in the boardroom, which is invite people to participate versus board members having to break in. It's incredibly uplifting and changes the nature of the conversation. When you have a new CEO, reset the relationship to zero and grow together. It's not a baton handoff. You really need to reset to zero and grow together. And the final thing is coaching isn't remedial. Coaching is truly a sign of high performance and expansion.
Yeah. I like your point about having the, let me call it constructive friction in the boardroom. I mean, and so I think all of us would agree that maybe we don't do the best job doing board evaluations. There's a lot that could be done there, but that's the kind of topic where you'd really want to get a grip on. Do you actually get a chance to talk? Does anybody listen to you? Things like that. But how do you open up this avenue, particularly for new board members, so that you could have that dialogue? But
Just on that point, David,
yeah,
I would say in a high trust board
yeah,
relationship, that dialogue is happening all the time.
yes, of
The
course,
CEO is providing feedback on, hey, this is what would help me and our team, and the board is providing feedback on, hey, we need to hear more of this so that it's not a once a year kind of thing. But again, it all boils down to the central theme of what we've been talking about, which is building trust.
yes. So this has been great. Thank you so much, Amy,
Thank you.
Stephen. For the participants out there, if you've got kind of an interesting story to tell about, how it works for you or experiences you've had with coaches or kitchen cabinets, please reach out to me. We're always looking for, good examples to tell and learning. So I hope everybody found this to be useful, and it's always fun for me, certainly, to help SVDX. And thanks, Amy and Steve, so
Thank
much.
you all very
Thank you,
much. It's a
David.
pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah, likewise.
Nance,
Thank you,
turning it over to you.
everybody.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks so much to Dave, Amy, and Stephen. Thanks to everybody for joining us. I will send out an email with some of the links and reports and data that the panelists were speaking about. And I will send a link for the recording for those who would like to share it. So thanks again. Have a
All
wonderful
right,
week,
thanks.
everybody.
Thank you. Thanks,
See
Dave,
you.
very
Thank you,
much.
guys.
Yeah, bye-bye.